Now, if you want more on this, this is the EU Field Guide. So this is the European Union Field Guide to how to manage complexity in a crisis. Now, I want to make a key difference between robustness and resilience here. So robustness is like a seawall or a riverbank. It's wonderfully robust. It's very efficient because I can actually farm on the landward side. And it's really useful until it breaks, and then the result is catastrophic. Right? On the other hand, we had a seawall break in the Gower Peninsula in South Wales recently. Well, recently in geographical time, not human time. And so they decided not to rebuild it. They let the land become a salt marsh. Salt marsh is a hugely rich ecological environment. And if you haven't eaten Welsh salt marsh lamb, go and buy some now. It's absolutely brilliant because of the herbs and everything else. But the point about the salt marsh is it absorbs a huge amount of water. And even when it's saturated, it doesn't release it. And it survives by constantly shifting and changing. So a robust system doesn't change, a breach is catastrophic. A resilient system changes, release is not catastrophic, but it's inefficient compared with a robust system. And this is the efficiency v. effectiveness argument, all right? And by the way, to be effective, you have to be inefficient. Boassa and I, when he was alive, worked on a measure of what we call requisite inefficiency. So how can we measure how inefficient you need to be based on your market context? And that's still relevant in today's environment. So first thing you need to do is use your employees as a sensor network. Remember that picture I showed earlier? I've got every employee able to give me feedback within 3 minutes. So faced with a situation where I've got high ambiguity, I don't commission research, I use my networks to give me patterns, and a dominant pattern is evidence-based to proceed. This is what we're also now looking at citizens. I argued 8 years ago, if we had every school child at the age of 16 as a ethnographer into their communities, we'd have a human sensor network which, quote unquote, if we ever have a major pandemic, will be really useful because we can actually do lockdown progressively where people are ready to do it. We won't have to use universal. Right? So we need to start to build these things at company level and society level now, because we can't do the gross solutions we did during COVID. We're going to have to do something more sophisticated. Second thing is you need to build informal networks. Remember that method I taught for software development? We put young employees together with people about to retire, together with somebody on the management development program. Yet what we're constantly doing is entangling people in different combinations, because if you entangle people, that's the way you share knowledge across silos. And you can measure this. So informal networks are actually the mycelium, the fungal roots that connect the tree roots. And that's really important, because if you don't have a dense informal network, you've got a problem. Singapore government has got a really good one, because everybody does national service in the army. So they all know each other because they've done a year or 2 years in the army, they've gone back for exercises, their networks go across educational backgrounds. England has a really bad one because the elite all went to the same 3 schools and the same 2 universities, so it's a perverse network. And go into French industry and find anybody who didn't go to a Paris Grande École, and you'll see the lack of diversity in both of those countries' governance systems. Yeah? So that ability to network is key, and that should be a measure of health for any HR director, is how dense are your informal networks, and that's easy to do. And the third one, this is called acceptation. Now, this is a key concept in innovation. So if you don't know it, all dinosaurs had feathers, and they were very colorful. We know this from discoveries in North China. It's pretty evident they evolved principally for sexual display. Yeah, so you then get this small breed of dinosaur which starts to develop skin flaps under its forelimbs, so it adapts over time, and that allows it, like a peacock, to better display its feathers for sexual purposes. And it's a very small dinosaur, and it's more prey than it is predator, so it has to run very fast, and when it runs, it starts to glide. And that's how we get flight. Yeah? It couldn't happen in a linear way, because if dinosaurs jumped off cliffs in the hope of evolving feathers before they hit the ground, they probably wouldn't get a chance to breed. So what happened is a trait which evolved for one function in a linear way, under stress, exapts for something completely different. The scary one, by the way, for you is the cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved in higher apes to manipulate muscles in fingers, and then exapts in humans to manage grammar in language. The huge sophistication of grammar wasn't possible in a linear way. It's too big a step. So it requires this nonlinear repurposing. Most of your higher functions evolved for something completely different. And if you look at it in technology, IBM was the worldwide market leader in punch card technology. It repurposed it to give it early dominance in the computer industry. In 1945, somebody realized the significance of a chocolate bar melting in their pocket. They put a metal box around it. We got microwave ovens. Now, the primary work, by the way, on this field is done at an annual conference up on Lake Garda, which I'm part of, with Milan University. But the whole conditions for exaptation is something you can manage. Because in a crisis, you need to rapidly repurpose things you're already good at for something completely new. And that means mapping what you know at the right level of granularity, and very few organizations do that. And then kind of like, if anybody wants to get into this, and I'm going to talk about this briefly now, constraints are key. Constraints are the only thing you can manage in a complex adaptive system. So we need to map the constraints and understand them. And I'll just draw where we're going on that in a second. And I'm checking, I know how long I've got because I know when he finished, so I'm working to that. If you want to know more about this, by the way, you can download the field guide for free. You can get a free physical copy of it. If you've had the sense to remain Europeans, you don't have to pay the postage. If you're not Europeans, you have to pay the postage. But you can get that. And there's a whole flow chart and everything around this about how you adopt it. One of the big things we're doing for companies at the moment is go back and map everything which happened during COVID, what worked, what didn't work, building that interesting into what's called a sacred storybook, because we need to remember what happened in COVID, and narrative is a form on that, and then identifying ways forward. So I'll leave that with the QR code up later for that as it goes. So that leads me into kind of like the last two sections of what I'm doing, which I'm going to go very quickly, because this is going to be more tomorrow. The big thing we're now doing, this is the sort of third framework within Cynefin, is estuarine mapping. Now, one of the reasons I came up with the idea of an estuary is certain friends of mine who should know better started to talk about constructional law, where everything flows in one direction. And the whole problem with that is that reality is human systems are not subject to the second law of thermodynamics. So taking a thermodynamics model is a bad starting place, all right? Open systems. Right? And also, human beings work through abstractions. We can go backwards as well as forwards. Right? So the point about an estuary is not a delta. A delta is where the water flows into the ocean. In an estuary, the water comes back in up the river channel. So the water goes in and the water goes out. Right? And you can do things at the turn of the tide that you can't do when the tide is flowing. There are granite cliffs you only have to survey every 20 years. There are sandbanks you have to check every day. So the metaphor of an estuary is a really good understanding of the sort of place we live in. And the way we're now working on that, and so I'll do this tomorrow, is we're basically building a grid, which is energy cost of change against time to change. We're mapping the constraints onto that, and then we're identifying what's called the counterfactual line. And that says everything this side of the line isn't going to change. So our space of operation is here. Now, so I'm going to go through this tomorrow. I'm more excited by this than I was about Cynefin, because it doesn't say what do we want to be. It says what's the space in which we're playing, and how do we stabilize that system, because the fundamental principle is whatever has the lowest energy gradient will win. If the energy cost of sin is lower than the energy cost of virtue, people will sin. In complexity, you change the environment so that good things are more likely to happen, and then you reinforce it. You don't decide what those things should be in advance because you can't know, and that's a real switch in the way that we think. So, to finish, what do we do about Agile? If you haven't read the book, there's a famous British book which I'm referencing here. Agile has become a bunch of ainly retentive control fetishists fighting framework wars who think everything is about who's got the better certificates. Yeah? I remember when SAFE came out, I first saw it at Novi Sad, which is significant, all right, if you know the history of Novi Sad. And I remember writing a tirade at the guy, I don't often write angry blogs, well, yes I do, but this was a very angry one, called The Infantilization of Management. Yeah, the way SAFE worked, and I remember looking at it and saying, this is wrong a priori. And then the Agile people didn't know what I meant by a priori, which depressed me about their education, right? So I went a posteriori and it got more confused. It's wrong because you don't scale by aggregation, you scale by decomposition and recombination. Right? So we've got to do something different about Agile because it's lost that edge. And one of the things I've been talking about of late is kind of like the need to rewild it. This is the nearest thing we got to the original canine in evolutionary history. It's a prairie wolf. Now, when you domesticate, and there's about 8 or 9 varieties of wild canine, and they're very resilient. If you domesticate them, you end up with a huge amount of non-functional things which wouldn't survive in the wild. That's the state of Agile. Yeah? Is nothing but a serious, yeah. So where we're going on this, and the other problem is, what we call the mindset miasma. Sorry, I thought I'd use a plague mask. I think that is from Florence, actually, that famous illustration. Yeah, because we didn't understand the plague, so people thought if they wore those masks, it would be brilliant. Mindset is a completely nonsensical term like mental models. It's not the way we make decisions. Consciousness is distributed into the body and our social connections. There isn't a mindset. This is a computer model of the human brain, and it's not like that. And the trouble with mindset, as Nigel said, is if my big program, my wonderful agile program doesn't work, it's not my fault, it's your fault, because you didn't have an agile mindset. Right? We now talk about this, I'll do more on this tomorrow, but we talk about what has agency, what has affordance, and what has assemblage. And we don't mean by assemblage what he means by assemblage, but that's an ongoing debate, all right? Some of us show respect for Deleuze and Guattari, but basically, agency is what or who can actually act. Affordance is what's enabled to you by the environment you're in, which includes your own history. And assemblage are the patterns of micro-narratives which determine the way you see the world. Yeah? And actually, that's a much more meaningful way of talking about it than mindset of mental models, because I've described a problem in the way that I can do something. And so, as Nigel said, the way we're going with Agile, and this is an open source initiative, is basically we're taking every Agile framework and method, working with the originators to break it down into its lowest coherent components, and then creating kits by which people can combine and recombine in different ways. So you can peel a sprint out of a scrum and replace it with a 3-month time box. Yeah? And you'll see on this, if you look at it, here we've got our methods, which are branded cognitive edge. I just talked about entangled trios. 888 I'll go through tomorrow. Here we've been working with Ivor Jacobson with his version of Scrum at Sail, breaking it down, but we're going to have 3 Scrum sets in it. And overall, there's a whole principle about how they work, a standard set. And all of this is open source. Anybody can copy it. And it's got a completely separate brand from our brand. Our methods and tools are branded Cynefin Company. It's an independent brand. It's open source. Anybody can produce. And we're not just doing this for Agile, by the way. We're doing this for foresight and strategy and organizational change. And the idea is to move away from the big consultancies, the big technical firms with a single approach and a single framework into multi-method, multi-vendor. So if anybody's interested in that, get in touch. And I'll just leave you with one final thought. Actually, process matters. You can have the most gifted leaders, the most motivated people, the best mindsets, but the reality is if you haven't built a body of methods and tools and process which has been tested over the years, you will not survive as an organization. It's about systems more than it's about people. And in complexity, how people connect is far more important than what they are. And it's more ethical to manage that. Thank you very much for your time.